bullet grazed past Prescott Walker's ear so close he felt the heat of it, and he dove behind a water trough outside the saloon in Mineral Park, Arizona, his hands trembling as he drew his revolver and fired back at the three outlaws who had decided robbing the general store in broad daylight was a good idea on this scorching August afternoon in 1883. The shaking in his fingers had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the fever burning through his body like wildfire. But he would be damned if he let these men terrorize the town he had sworn to protect as deputy marshal. Sweat poured down his face, though whether from the relentless desert sun or the illness ravaging him, he could not say. His vision blurred momentarily as he squeezed off another shot, and he heard one of the outlaws cry out. The other two scrambled for their horses, and Prescott forced himself to stand on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, advancing slowly as the remaining bandits fled down the dusty main street. Marshal Henderson came running from the telegraph office, his weathered face creased with concern. "Good shooting, Walker," he called out, but Prescott barely heard him over the ringing in his ears. He holstered his weapon and turned toward the general store to check on the owners, but the world tilted sideways, and he had to grab the hitching post to keep from falling. The rough wood bit into his palm, grounding him for a moment as he fought to clear his head. "You all right there?" Henderson asked, coming closer now, his sharp eyes taking in Prescott's pale complexion beneath the layer of dust and sweat. "Fine," Prescott managed, though the word came out rougher than intended. "It's just the heat." Henderson looked skeptical, but nodded. "Get yourself some water. I will handle the rest here." He paused, studying Prescott more carefully. "Maybe take the rest of the day. You look like hell." Prescott wanted to argue, wanted to insist he was perfectly capable of finishing his shift, but another wave of dizziness washed over him, and he found himself nodding. "Just need some shade," he said, and started walking toward his small room behind the jail before Henderson could ask more questions. Each step felt like wading through molasses, and by the time he reached his door, his shirt was soaked through with sweat. He collapsed onto his narrow bed without bothering to remove his boots, and the last thing he remembered before darkness claimed him was the sound of horses passing by his window and a woman's voice calling out cheerfully to someone on the street. He woke to the sound of knocking, insistent and loud enough to cut through the fog in his head. Prescott groaned and tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. The knocking came again, more urgent this time, and he heard a woman's voice call out, "Deputy Walker, Marshal Henderson sent me to check on you." "Go away," Prescott called back, or tried to. His voice came out as barely more than a croak. The door opened anyway, and he would have been annoyed about the intrusion if he had the energy for it. Instead, he could only watch through half-closed eyes as a woman stepped into his room, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light streaming through the doorway. "Good Lord," she said, and her voice was clear and strong with an accent that spoke of education back east. "You are burning up." Cool fingers touched his forehead, and despite himself, Prescott leaned into the touch. It felt like heaven against his fevered skin. "How long have you been sick?" "Not sick," he muttered. "Just tired." "Men," she said, and there was exasperation in her tone, but also something softer, gentler. "Always too stubborn to admit when they need help." She moved away, and Prescott heard her footsteps crossing the small room, the sound of his wash basin being filled from the pitcher he kept on the dresser. Then she was back, pressing a cool, damp cloth to his forehead, and he could not stop the sigh of relief that escaped him. "Who are you?" he managed to ask, forcing his eyes open enough to get a look at his uninvited nurse. She was young, probably around his own age of 24, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes the color of honey in sunlight. Her dress was simple but well made, the deep green fabric dusty from travel. There was intelligence in her face, and a determination that suggested she was not the type to back down easily. "Zara Olsen," she said, wringing out the cloth and pressing it to his face again. "I arrived in town this morning to take the teaching position at the new schoolhouse. Marshal Henderson mentioned his deputy had looked unwell after the shooting, and when I passed by and heard you in here, Well, I could not in good conscience leave you alone. She paused, studying him with those sharp eyes. When did the fever start? Prescott wanted to lie, wanted to tell her it was nothing, but something in her gaze made him think she would see right through any deception. 3 days ago, he admitted. Maybe 4. I thought I could push through it. Men always think that, Zara said, shaking her head, and they always end up worse for it. You need rest, proper rest and fluids. When did you last eat? Prescott had to think about that. Yesterday morning, I think. Zara made a sound of disapproval and stood up. I am going to get some supplies and make you something to eat. Do not even think about getting out of that bed. You do not have to do this, Prescott protested weakly. You just got into town. You must have things to do. Nothing more important than keeping the deputy marshal alive, Zara said firmly. Besides, I am not the type to walk away from someone in need. My mother always said that was both my greatest strength and my biggest flaw. She smiled then, quick and bright, and it did something strange to Prescott's chest that had nothing to do with the fever. I will be back shortly. Try not to do anything heroic while I'm gone. She left before he could respond, and Prescott lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. He had been taking care of himself since he was 16 years old, ever since his parents had died in a wagon accident on the trail west. He was not used to accepting help from anyone, let alone a complete stranger who had just arrived in town. But there was something about Zara Olsen, something in the way she had looked at him with concern rather than pity, that made him want to trust her. True to her word, she returned within the hour, her arms laden with supplies. Prescott had managed to prop himself up against the wall by then, though the effort had left him breathless and shaking. Zara took one look at him and frowned. I thought I told you to stay in bed. I am in bed, Prescott pointed out, just sitting up in it. Stubborn, she muttered, but there was a hint of amusement in her voice as she set down her burdens and began unpacking them. Prescott watched as she pulled out a jar of honey, a bundle of herbs that looked like chamomile and willow bark, a fresh loaf of bread, and a container of what smelled like chicken broth. Mrs. Chen at the boarding house was kind enough to provide the soup when I explained the situation. She said to tell you to stop trying to kill yourself through neglect. Despite feeling like death warmed over, Prescott found himself almost smiling at that. Mrs. Chen had been trying to mother him since he had arrived in Mineral Park 2 years ago with varying degrees of success. She would say that. Well, she is not wrong, Zara said, pouring some of the broth into a cup and bringing it over to him. Drink this slowly. Your stomach is not going to appreciate anything too heavy right now. Prescott took the cup, and their fingers brushed in the exchange. Even through the fever, he felt the spark of that contact, and from the way Zara's eyes widened slightly, she had felt it too. She pulled her hand back quickly and busied herself with mixing something that involved the herbs and hot water from the kettle she must have heated while he was not paying attention. The small room filled with the bitter scent of willow bark tea, and Prescott wrinkled his nose. I know it is not pleasant, Zara said without turning around, somehow sensing his reaction, but it will help with the fever. Drink your broth first, then the tea. You are very bossy for someone I just met, Prescott observed, but he obediently sipped the broth. It was rich and flavorful, and his stomach growled in appreciation despite his general feeling of misery. I prefer to think of it as being practical and efficient, Zara replied, finally turning to face him with a cup of the bitter-smelling tea in her hands. Someone has to make sure you do not succumb to your own stubbornness. Now finish that broth. They fell into a comfortable silence as Prescott slowly worked his way through the soup, and Zara settled into the rickety chair by his small table, watching him with an expression that was part concern and part something else he could not quite identify. When he finally set down the empty cup, she immediately replaced it with the tea, and he grimaced at the first sip. It tastes like dirt, he complained. It tastes like medicine, Zara corrected, and you are going to drink every drop. You are a very hard woman, Miss Olsen. And you are a very difficult patient, Deputy Walker. I suppose we shall have to make the best of it. She paused, then added more softly, "Why were you hiding the fever? Surely Marshal Henderson would have given you time to recover." Prescott stared down at the tea in his hands, watching the steam rise from its surface. "We are short-staffed as it is," he said finally. "Henderson does most of the work around here, and he is not getting any younger. The town needs protecting, and I will not be the one to leave it vulnerable just because I feel a little under the weather." "A little under the weather," Zara repeated incredulously. "You can barely sit up without shaking. That is not a little under the weather. That is a serious fever that could turn into something much worse if left untreated." Her voice softened. "I understand the desire to be strong, to not let others down, but you cannot help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion and illness. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you need help." Prescott looked up at her then, really looked at her, and saw not judgment in her eyes, but genuine understanding. "You sound like you were speaking from experience." A shadow passed across Zara's face, quick but unmistakable. "My father was a doctor in Boston," she said quietly. "He worked through a cholera outbreak when I was 17, refused to rest even when he started showing symptoms. He thought he was indispensable, that the patients needed him more than he needed sleep or treatment." She paused, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He died 3 days later. So yes, I am speaking from experience when I say that martyring yourself helps no one." "I am sorry," Prescott said, and meant it. "That must have been hard." "It was," Zara agreed, "but it taught me the value of insisting people take care of themselves, even when they do not want to. So you are going to drink that tea, and then you are going to sleep, and I am going to sit right here and make sure you do both of those things." "You do not have to stay," Prescott protested, even as he obediently drank more of the bitter tea. "You must have a dozen things to prepare for the school term." "The school does not start for another 2 weeks," Zara said, "and I am not leaving you alone to suffer in stubborn silence. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "I have already made it my mission to ensure your recovery. I always see my missions through to the end." Prescott wanted to argue, but the warmth of the broth in his stomach and whatever was in the tea Zara had made him was already making him drowsy. His eyelids felt heavy, and keeping them open required more effort than he could muster. "Just for a little while," he heard himself say. "Then you should go." "We will see," was Zara's response, and her voice seemed to come from very far away now. "Sleep, Prescott. I will be here when you wake." He wanted to tell her she did not need to use his first name, that they barely knew each other, but the words would not come. Instead, he felt himself sliding down into the pillows, felt the cup being gently removed from his hands, and then there was only darkness and the distant sensation of a cool cloth on his forehead. When Prescott woke again, the light had changed. Long shadows stretched across the floor, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. For a moment, he was disoriented, unsure what had pulled him from sleep. Then he heard it, a soft humming, and turned his head to see Zara still sitting in the chair beside his bed. She had lit the oil lamp on the table, and in its warm glow she was mending what looked like one of his shirts, the one he had torn on a fence post last week and had been meaning to fix for days. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, and she hummed as she worked. Some tune he did not recognize but found oddly soothing. "You are still here," he said, and his voice came out less rough than before, though still not quite normal. Zara looked up and her face brightened when she saw he was awake. "You are lucid," she said with obvious relief, "and that's a good sign. How do you feel?" Prescott took stock of himself. His head still ached, and his body felt weak, but the overwhelming burning sensation had lessened to a more manageable discomfort. "Better," he admitted. "Still not great, but better." "Good. The fever broke about an hour ago. You have been sleeping for nearly 5 hours." She set aside the mending and reached for another cup. "I need you to drink more tea, and then I have some bread and honey for you if you think you can manage it." "You have been here the whole time?" Prescott asked, accepting the cup she offered. The tea was still bitter, but not quite as horrible as before, or maybe he was just getting used to it. I told you I would be, Zara said simply, as if sitting for 5 hours in a cramped room watching a sick man sleep was the most natural thing in the world. Besides, you talked quite a bit in your fever dreams. I learned some very interesting things about you. Prescott felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with illness. I did not say anything too embarrassing, I hope. That depends on your definition of embarrassing, Zara said, and there was definite amusement in her voice now. You apparently have very strong opinions about the quality of coffee at the saloon. You miss your horse terribly even though you see him every day, and you once thought very seriously about becoming a schoolteacher yourself before choosing law enforcement. I did not know I said all that, Prescott muttered, drinking the tea to avoid meeting her eyes. You also, Zara continued, her voice gentler now, called out for your parents several times. I'm sorry, Prescott, I did not mean to make light of your pain. Prescott was quiet for a long moment, the cup warm between his palms. He rarely talked about his parents, about the accident that had left him alone at 16 with nothing but a horse and his father's old revolver. It has been 8 years, he said finally. You would think it would hurt less by now. Grief does not work on a schedule, Zara said softly. I still miss my father every day, and it has been 7 years since he died. Some losses you learn to live with, but they never really go away. She paused. He would be proud of you, I think, your father. You clearly took the responsibility of protecting others to heart. How do you know that? Prescott asked, finally looking at her. You do not know anything about me. I know you pushed yourself to the point of collapse rather than leave your town vulnerable, Zara said. I know you faced down 3 armed outlaws this afternoon despite being so sick you could barely stand. I know Mrs. Chen speaks of you with obvious affection, and Marshal Henderson trusts you enough to send a complete stranger to check on you. Those things tell me quite a bit about your character. Prescott did not know what to say to that. He had spent so long thinking of himself as just doing his job, just fulfilling his duty, that he had never stopped to consider how others might see him. You are very observant, Miss Olsen. Zara, she corrected. If we are using first names, we might as well both do it. And yes, I have been told I notice things others miss. It is a useful trait for a teacher, though it can make social situations awkward when you point out things people would prefer remained unobserved. Is that why you left Boston? Prescott asked, then immediately wondered if he had overstepped. I'm sorry, that was too personal. No, it is all right, Zara said, though her expression grew more guarded. I left Boston because there was nothing left for me there. My mother remarried 2 years after my father died, and while her new husband is perfectly pleasant, their home never felt like mine. I wanted to do something meaningful, something that would have made my father proud. When I saw the advertisement for a teaching position in Arizona Territory, it seemed like fate. She smiled, but it was tinged with something wistful. Plus, I have always wanted to see the West. The wide open spaces, the sense of possibility. Boston felt suffocating after a while, all those rules and expectations. The West has plenty of rules, Prescott observed. They are just different ones and enforced differently. Exactly, Zara said, and her smile grew more genuine. Different is what I needed. A chance to be someone other than the poor girl whose father died tragically, the spinster daughter living on her stepfather's charity. Here, I can just be Zara, the new school teacher. No past, no expectations beyond doing my job well. Everyone has a past, Prescott said quietly. The West does not erase that, no matter how far you run. Perhaps not, Zara agreed, but it gives you the chance to decide how much of that past defines you. That is worth something, I think. She stood and moved to the small shelf where she had left the bread and honey. Now enough heavy conversation. You need to eat something, and then you are going to sleep through the night. In the morning, we will see how you feel and whether you are ready to resume your duties. You are not going to stay all night, Prescott said, alarmed at the thought. People will talk. People always talk, Zara said dismissively, slicing the bread with a competence that spoke of much practice. especially about women who do not conform to their narrow ideas of proper behavior. I stopped caring about that years ago." She brought him the bread, drizzled with honey and surprisingly appetizing despite his still uncertain stomach. "Besides, Mrs. Chen knows I am here. She sent over blankets earlier while you were sleeping so I could make myself comfortable. Apparently, she approves of my taking care of you, and her opinion carries significant weight in this town." Prescott accepted the bread, shaking his head in bemusement. "You have been here less than a day, and you have already enlisted Mrs. Chen as an ally? That is impressive. I told you I am good at observing people. It was obvious she cares about you and would appreciate someone making sure you actually recover properly. We bonded over our shared frustration with stubborn men who refuse to take care of themselves." Zara settled back into her chair, pulling one of the blankets Mrs. Chen had provided around her shoulders. "Now eat and then sleep. Those are your only two jobs right now." Prescott wanted to protest more, wanted to insist that she leave and let him suffer through the night alone as he had planned, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the fever still making him weak, or maybe it was the strange comfort of having someone care enough to stay. Either way, he found himself eating the bread and honey, found himself settling back into the pillows, found himself drifting off to sleep with the knowledge that Zara was nearby, watching over him with those sharp, caring eyes. He woke several times during the night, and each time she was there. Once he found her reading by lamplight, a book open in her lap. Another time, she was standing by the small window looking out at the moonlit street with an expression of longing that made his chest ache. The third time, she was dozing in the chair, her head tilted at an angle that looked profoundly uncomfortable, and before he could think better of it, Prescott spoke. "Zara." His voice was barely a whisper, but she woke immediately, alert in an instant. "Take the bed. I can sleep in the chair." "Do not be ridiculous," she said, stifling a yawn. "You are the one recovering from a fever. And you are the one who has been awake for nearly 24 hours, Prescott countered. "Besides, that chair is terrible for sleeping. Trust me, I have tried. Please, I will feel awful knowing you are suffering for my sake." Zara studied him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing propriety against practicality. Finally, she sighed. "I will compromise. We are both adults, and this bed is just barely large enough for two if we are respectful about it. You stay on your side, I will stay on mine, and we both get some actual rest. Agreed?" Prescott knew he should refuse, knew this was exactly the kind of thing that would set tongues wagging all over Mineral Park. But his body ached, his head still throbbed despite the tea, and the thought of Zara spending another hour in that miserable chair made something in him protest. "Agreed," he said finally, "but you take the side closer to the wall. If anyone comes in, at least it will look slightly less scandalous." "Ever the gentleman," Zara said, but she was smiling as she moved to the far side of the narrow bed. She lay down on top of the blankets, still fully dressed, and Prescott was acutely aware of her warmth beside him, close enough that he could hear her breathing. "Good night, Prescott." "Good night, Zara," he replied, and closed his eyes, willing sleep to come quickly before he could think too hard about the fact that there was a beautiful, intelligent woman in his bed, and all he could do was lie there and try not to move. Morning came too quickly, announced by roosters crowing and the sounds of the town waking up around them. Prescott opened his eyes to find Zara already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed and pinning her hair back into its practical bun. She turned when she heard him stir, and her face lit up with a smile. "Your color is much better," she announced, "and you do not feel nearly as hot. I think the fever has truly broken." Prescott realized she was right. His head felt clearer than it had in days, and while he was still tired, it was normal tiredness rather than the crushing exhaustion of illness. "You were right," he admitted. "The rest helped?" "Of course I was right," Zara said primly. "I am always right about these things. Now I am going to go get us some breakfast, and then we need to discuss your recovery plan. You're not going back on duty for at least 2 more days." "Zara," Prescott protested, but she held up a hand. 2 days minimum," she said firmly. "And that is only if you continue to improve. Try to argue and I will make it a week. You are terrifying, Prescott said, but he was smiling despite himself. I prefer to think of it as effective, Zara replied, standing and smoothing down her dress. I will be back shortly, stay in bed, drink water, and absolutely no thinking about work. She left before he could respond, and Prescott found himself lying there with a grin on his face that probably looked ridiculous. He barely knew this woman, had spent less than 24 hours in her company, but already he felt something shifting in his chest, some locked door creaking open after years of being firmly closed. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, and he had no idea what to do about it. Zara returned with food from Mrs. Chen, who had apparently sent along enough for a small army along with strict instructions that Prescott was to eat every bite. They ate together in companionable silence, and afterward, Zara insisted on checking him over one more time, her cool fingers gentle against his forehead and wrist as she assessed his temperature and pulse. Much better, she pronounced, though you still need rest. I have to go meet with the school board this afternoon to finalize some details about the curriculum, but I will check on you this evening. You do not have to keep taking care of me, Prescott said, though the words came out without much conviction. I know I do not have to, Zara replied. I want to. Is that so hard to accept? Prescott looked at her, at the determination in those honey-colored eyes, and found he could not lie. Yes, he admitted. I have been alone for a long time, Zara. I am not used to people caring. Something softened in her expression, and she reached out to squeeze his hand briefly. Well, you had better get used to it because I'm not going anywhere. Someone has to make sure you do not work yourself into an early grave. She left then, and Prescott spent the rest of the day drifting between sleep and wakefulness, his mind occupied with thoughts of dark hair and honey-colored eyes, and a smile that made his heart do strange things in his chest. Marshall Henderson stopped by in the early afternoon, looking pleased to see Prescott in better shape. That school teacher is something else, Henderson observed, settling into the chair Zara had occupied for so many hours. Half the town is talking about how she spent the night here taking care of you. Let them talk, Prescott said, surprised by his own vehemence. She probably saved my life. I do not care what gossips have to say about it. Henderson's eyebrows rose. That is quite a change from the man who was worried about propriety when Mrs. Chen wanted to have you over for Sunday dinner. You sweet on Miss Olsen already? I barely know her, Prescott protested, but he could feel heat rising to his face. Sometimes that is all it takes, Henderson said, with the wisdom of a man who had been married for 30 years. My wife and I knew within a day of meeting that we were meant for each other. Took us a year to admit it out loud, but we both knew. He stood, patting Prescott on the shoulder. Take your time recovering, son. The town will still be here when you are ready to come back, and I am managing just fine. Do not rush things. After Henderson left, Prescott lay there thinking about his words. Could you really know someone was special after just one day? It seemed impossible, illogical, the kind of thing that happened in dime novels rather than real life. And yet, he could not deny that something had shifted inside him from the moment Zara had walked into his room and refused to leave him to suffer alone. True to her word, Zara returned that evening with more food and an armful of books. I thought you might be getting bored, she explained, setting them on the table. Mrs. Chen said you like to read when you have the time, which apparently is not often. Mrs. Chen talks too much, Prescott said, but he was already reaching for the books with interest. There were novels, poetry, even a book on the history of the Western Territories. Thank you. This is thoughtful. Well, I have to keep you occupied somehow, or you will start thinking about work and undermine your own recovery, Zara said, settling into what Prescott was starting to think of as her chair. How are you feeling? Better, Prescott said honestly. Almost normal, actually. I think one more day of rest, and I will be ready to return to duty. 2 more days, Zara corrected. We agreed on 2 days minimum, remember? I thought that was just if I continued to improve, Prescott argued. It was, and you have, but that does not mean you are ready to jump back into chasing outlaws and maintaining law and order. Your body needs time to fully recover, not just partially. Zara fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. 2 days, Prescott, I mean it. Prescott sighed but nodded. 2 days, though I do not know what I am supposed to do with myself for that long. Read, Zara suggested, and rest. Maybe tell me about yourself so I can get to know the real you instead of just the feverish version who complained about coffee and missed his horse. Despite himself, Prescott laughed. What do you want to know? Everything, Zara said simply. Start with why you became a lawman. You mentioned once thinking about teaching. So Prescott told her. He talked about his parents, about the wagon accident that had orphaned him, about the kindness of the marshal in the town where it happened who had taken him in and taught him what it meant to serve and protect. He talked about his first few years drifting from town to town, trying to find a place that felt like home until he landed in Mineral Park and realized he wanted to stay. He talked about the satisfaction of helping people, of making a difference, even if it was just keeping drunk cowboys from shooting up the saloon on Saturday nights. Zara listened with complete attention, occasionally asking questions that showed she was not just hearing his words, but truly understanding them. In return, she told him more about her life in Boston, about the stifling expectations of society there, about her father's dedication to medicine, and how it had inspired her to find her own way of helping people through teaching. She talked about the loneliness of the past few years, about feeling like she did not quite fit anywhere, and how the decision to come west had felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. And now? Prescott asked when she paused. How does Mineral Park compare to what you were hoping for? Zara was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. It is different than I imagined, she said finally. Smaller, dustier, more isolated. But there is something here, something I did not expect. A sense of possibility maybe, or maybe just a feeling that I could belong somewhere for the first time in years. Her eyes met his, and there was something vulnerable in them, something that made Prescott's breath catch. I think I'm going to like it here. I hope you do, Prescott said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. The town could use someone like you, someone who cares, who is not afraid to help even when it is difficult or uncomfortable. Someone like you mean? Zara said softly. You could have stayed in bed during that robbery attempt, Prescott. No one would have blamed you for being too sick to help, but you got up anyway, put yourself in danger anyway, because that is who you are. I was just doing my job, Prescott protested. You were doing more than that, Zara insisted. You were being the kind of person others can count on, and that matters. That makes a difference. They talked long into the evening, until Zara's eyes were drooping with exhaustion and Prescott realized she had probably been up since dawn. You should go get some rest, he said, though part of him wanted her to stay. I will be fine tonight. Are you sure? Zara asked, already gathering her things. I can stay if you need me. I am sure, Prescott said, even though it was not entirely true. Go sleep in a real bed instead of that terrible chair. You have done more than enough. Zara nodded, but she hesitated at the door. I will check on you in the morning before I head to the schoolhouse. And Prescott, thank you for sharing your story with me. It means a lot. Thank you for listening, Prescott replied, and for everything else. I do not think I have properly thanked you for taking care of me. You do not need to thank me, Zara said with a smile. Just promise me you will actually rest for the next 2 days instead of trying to sneak back to work early. I promise, Prescott said, and watched as she slipped out into the night, taking some indefinable warmth with her. The next 2 days passed in a strange sort of limbo. Prescott rested as ordered, reading the books Zara had brought and forcing himself not to think about what might be happening in town. Zara came by twice a day, once in the morning before heading to prepare the schoolhouse, and once in the evening after she was done. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing, and Prescott found himself looking forward to her visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and unnerved him. On the third day, he returned to duty despite Zara's continued protests that he should take more time. Marshal Henderson put him on light duties, mostly paperwork and checking in with local business owners, nothing that would tax his still recovering strength. Prescott chafed at the restrictions but complied, knowing that Zara would hear about it if he overexerted himself and would probably show up to lecture him. He saw her around town occasionally, always busy with preparations for the school term that would start in just over a week. She had a gift for connecting with people, he noticed, and already seemed to know half the town by name. Children followed her around when she walked down the main street, drawn by her ready smile and patient answers to their endless questions. She would make an excellent teacher, Prescott thought, and felt an odd surge of pride at the idea. A week after his fever broke, Prescott was doing his evening rounds when he saw a light still burning in the schoolhouse. It was late, well past the time Zara usually finished her work, and concern made him change direction to check on her. He found her inside, surrounded by books and papers, her face creased with concentration as she worked on what looked like lesson plans. "You are going to work yourself sick," Prescott observed from the doorway, and Zara looked up with a start. "Prescott," she said, and her face brightened in a way that made his heart skip. "I did not hear you come in. What are you doing here?" "Making sure everyone is safe," Prescott said, stepping into the schoolhouse. It smelled of new wood and chalk and possibility. That includes stubborn school teachers who do not know when to stop working. "I could say the same about stubborn lawmen who returned to duty earlier than recommended," Zara countered, but she was smiling. "I am almost done here. I just want to finish these plans for the first week." "You have been at this for hours," Prescott said, noting the way she rubbed at her temples. "Take a break. Walk with me for a bit. The fresh air will do you good." Zara looked like she wanted to refuse, but then she glanced down at the papers scattered around her and sighed. "You are right. I have been staring at these so long the words are starting to blur together." She stood, stretching with a wince. "A walk sounds nice, actually." They stepped out into the cool desert night, the sky overhead blazing with more stars than seemed possible. The main street was quiet at this hour, most of the saloon patrons having gone home or passed out, the respectable citizens long since in bed. It felt like they had the whole town to themselves, and Prescott found himself walking close enough to Zara that their shoulders occasionally brushed. "Are you nervous?" he asked as they walked. "About starting classes next week?" "Terrified," Zara admitted with a laugh. "What if I am terrible at it? What if the children hate me? What if I have made a huge mistake coming out here?" "You will be wonderful," Prescott said with absolute conviction. "I have seen you with the children around town. They already adore you, and you have not even officially started teaching yet." "That is different," Zara protested. "That is just being friendly. Actually teaching them, being responsible for their education, that is something else entirely." "You will figure it out," Prescott assured her, "just like you figured out how to nurse a stubborn deputy back to health despite his best efforts to refuse help." Zara laughed at that, the sound bright in the quiet night. "Fair point. Though in my defense, you were not particularly difficult once I got you to actually drink the tea." They had reached the edge of town now, where the buildings gave way to open desert stretching endlessly under the star-filled sky. Prescott stopped, looking out at the vast darkness, and Zara stopped beside him. For a long moment neither of them spoke, just stood together in the comfortable silence they had developed over the past week and a half. "Can I ask you something?" Zara said finally, her voice soft. "Anything," Prescott replied. "Why have you not married?" She paused, then added quickly, "I am sorry, that is too personal. You do not have to answer." "No, it is all right," Prescott said, though the question made something tighten in his chest. "I suppose I never found the right person. Or maybe I never let myself look, never let myself think about building that kind of life. After my parents died, I think part of me was afraid to care that much about someone again, knowing I could lose them." He turned to look at her, finding her watching him with those perceptive eyes. "What about you? You said your stepfather called you a spinster daughter. Why did you never marry?" "Same reason, maybe," Zara said. "Fear of loss, fear of carrying too much. But also because the men in Boston wanted someone decorative and obedient, someone who would make them look good at parties and never have an opinion of their own. I could never be that person even when I tried." She smiled, but it was tinged with old sadness. After a while, I stopped trying. Decided I would rather be alone than pretend to be someone I was not. I am glad you never pretended, Prescott said quietly. The world needs more people who are authentically themselves, not less. Zara met his eyes, and in the starlight her face was beautiful and open and so close he could count her freckles if he tried. Prescott, she began, and then stopped, seeming to wrestle with something internal. Yes, he prompted gently. I am glad I came to Mineral Park, she said finally. And I am especially glad I met you, even if it was because you were hiding a dangerous fever and needed someone to bully you into taking care of yourself. Prescott laughed, the sound surprised out of him. I am glad you met me too, even under those circumstances. You are remarkable, Zara Olsen. I have never met anyone quite like you. Is that a good thing? Zara asked, and there was real vulnerability in the question. It is the best thing, Prescott said. And before he could talk himself out of it, before fear and practicality could stop him, he reached out and took her hand in his. Her fingers were warm and strong, and they curled around his with a certainty that made his heart race. Zara, I know we have not known each other long, but I feel like I need to be honest with you. These past couple of weeks, getting to know you, spending time with you, it has meant more to me than I know how to express. You make me want things I thought I had given up on. You make me think about the future instead of just getting through each day. Prescott, Zara breathed, and her eyes were shining with what might have been tears or might have been starlight or might have been something else entirely. I feel the same way. I came to Mineral Park looking for a fresh start, looking for purpose, and I found all of that, but I also found you, and that was completely unexpected and absolutely terrifying and the best thing that has happened to me in years. So what do we do about it? Prescott asked, his thumb brushing across her knuckles, because I am terrible at this. Zara, I do not know how to court someone properly. I do not know the right words to say. All I know is that when I am with you, everything feels right in a way nothing has felt right since I lost my parents. You do not need fancy words, Zara said, stepping closer until there was barely any space between them. You just need to be honest, and you are. You just need to care, and you do. That is more than enough, Prescott. That is everything. He kissed her then, or maybe she kissed him. It was impossible to say who moved first. All Prescott knew was the softness of her lips, the way she sighed against his mouth, the feeling that something that had been broken inside him for years was finally, miraculously healing. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and tried to find words for the overwhelming emotion coursing through him. I want to do this properly, he said. I want to court you the right way, take you to dances and dinners, let everyone in town see how lucky I am. Is that all right? That is more than all right, Zara replied, smiling so wide it looked like it hurt. Though I should warn you, I am terrible at dancing. I have 2 left feet and absolutely no rhythm. I do not care, Prescott said, kissing her again because he could, because she was here and real and apparently wanted him as much as he wanted her. We will be terrible at it together. They walked back through town hand in hand, and if anyone saw them through their windows, Prescott did not care. Let them talk. Let them speculate. He had spent too long living his life according to duty and obligation, never allowing himself the luxury of personal happiness. But Zara had changed something fundamental in him, had shown him that it was possible to care about someone without it destroying you, possible to open your heart again even after loss. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Zara started teaching, and despite her fears, she was brilliant at it. Prescott would sometimes pass by the schoolhouse during his rounds and hear her voice carrying through the open windows, patient and encouraging as she guided her students through their lessons. In the evenings, when both their duties were done, they would meet for dinner at Mrs. Chen's boarding house or take walks around town, talking about their days and their dreams and slowly, carefully building something real between them. The town accepted their courtship with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Mrs. Chen was thrilled, constantly inviting them both over for meals and treating them like wayward children who needed feeding. Marshall Henderson approved. noting that Prescott seemed happier and less likely to work himself into an early grave now that he had someone to go home to. Some of the older women at church clucked their tongues about the impropriety of Zara having spent the night in Prescott's room, but even they had to admit that she was a good teacher and he was a good man, and if they chose to be together, well, that was their business. A month after they started courting, there was a dance in town to celebrate the end of the harvest season. Prescott had never been much for dancing, but he asked Zara anyway, and she laughed and said yes, even as she reminded him she had warned him about her complete lack of coordination. They were, as predicted, terrible at it, stepping on each other's feet and going the wrong direction more often than not. But it did not matter, because Zara was laughing in his arms and looking at him like he had hung the moon, and Prescott felt happier than he could remember being since before his parents died. "I love you," he said, as they stumbled through what was probably supposed to be a waltz. The words just came out, unplanned and completely sincere. "I know it is fast. I know we should probably wait longer before saying things like that, but I do. I love you, Zara." Zara stopped moving, right there in the middle of the dance floor with other couples swirling around them. Her eyes were wide and bright, and for a terrifying moment Prescott thought he had made a terrible mistake. But then she smiled, that brilliant smile that made his heart skip beats, and said, "I love you too, Prescott Walker. I think I have loved you since you tried to tell me you were not sick while literally shaking from fever." He kissed her right there in front of everyone, and someone whooped and others clapped, and Prescott could not have cared less about any of it. All that mattered was Zara in his arms. Zara who had seen him at his weakest and stayed anyway. Zara who had somehow found the broken parts of him and put them back together just by being herself. 3 months later, on a crisp November day with the desert air finally cooling into something like autumn, Prescott asked Zara to marry him. He did it properly, getting down on one knee in the middle of the schoolhouse after her students had left for the day, presenting her with a ring he had ordered special from San Francisco. It was not fancy, just a simple gold band with a small diamond, but Zara looked at it like it was the most precious thing she had ever seen. "Yes," she said, before he could even finish asking the question. "Yes, of course, yes, I will marry you." They were wed in December by the circuit preacher who came through Mineral Park every few months. Mrs. Chen insisted on hosting the reception at her boarding house, and it seemed like the entire town turned out to celebrate. Marshall Henderson served as Prescott's best man, and one of Zara's students' mothers stood up with her. It was simple and perfect, and when Prescott slipped the ring onto Zara's finger and promised to love and cherish her for the rest of his days, he meant every word with his entire heart. Married life suited them both. They moved into a small house at the edge of town, nothing fancy but theirs, and spent their evenings reading together by lamplight or sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the desert. Zara continued teaching, beloved by her students and their parents alike. Prescott continued working as deputy marshal, though he was more careful now about taking care of himself, knowing that Zara would notice immediately if he tried to push through illness or injury. A year and a half after their wedding, Zara told him she was pregnant. Prescott felt his heart might burst from joy and terror in equal measure. He was going to be a father, was going to have the family he had thought lost to him forever. Zara was nervous too, he could tell, but beneath the worry was a happiness that matched his own. Their son was born on a hot August day in 1885, exactly 2 years after the afternoon Prescott had faced down those outlaws while burning with fever. They named him Thomas after Prescott's father, and from the moment Prescott held that tiny, squalling infant in his arms, he understood what it meant to love someone more than your own life. Zara was radiant despite her exhaustion, and when she smiled up at him with their son cradled between them, Prescott thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. Thomas was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Catherine after Zara's mother. She had her mother's honey-colored eyes and her father's stubborn determination, and Prescott fell completely in love with her within seconds of her birth. Another son came 3 years after that, James, who was quiet and thoughtful and loved to read almost as much as Zara did. The years passed with the gentle rhythm of family life. There were challenges, certainly, A drought one year that left the town struggling. A band of cattle rustlers that required Prescott to spend 2 weeks tracking them down. Catherine getting sick with scarlet fever, and Zara nursing her through it with the same fierce determination she had once used to care for Prescott. But through it all, they had each other, and that made every hardship bearable. Marshall Henderson retired when Prescott was 32, and the town council offered Prescott the position. He accepted, knowing it was what he had been working toward all these years. Zara was proud of him, though she made him promise he would not take the same risks he had as deputy. He promised and meant it. He had too much to live for now to be careless with his life. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy who wanted to be a lawman like his father. Catherine became a voracious reader who announced at age 7 that she intended to be a doctor like her grandfather had been. James surprised them all by showing a talent for drawing, filling page after page with surprisingly skilled sketches of the desert landscape and the people around him. Prescott and Zara watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and amazement, marveling at how 3 such different people had somehow come from them. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Prescott took Zara back to the spot at the edge of town where they had first admitted their feelings for each other. The desert was bathed in starlight, just as it had been that night, and Zara looked at him with the same love she had shown then, deepened now by years of shared joy and sorrow and everyday life. "Do you ever regret it?" Prescott asked, pulling her close. "Staying here, marrying me, building this life instead of going back east or moving somewhere more civilized?" "Never," Zara said firmly. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be, Prescott. With you, with our children, in this dusty little town that became home, I would not change a single thing." "Even the part where you had to nurse me through a fever I was too stubborn to admit I had?" Prescott asked with a smile. "Especially that part," Zara replied, reaching up to touch his face with the same gentle care she had shown all those years ago. "Because that is when I first saw who you really were, beneath the tough lawman exterior. That is when I started to fall in love with you, even though I did not realize it yet." "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you walked into my room and refused to leave," Prescott admitted. "You were so fierce and determined, so completely unwilling to let me suffer alone. No one had cared about me like that since my parents died." "Well, you had better get used to it," Zara said, echoing the words she had spoken so long ago. "Because I am never going to stop caring, Prescott Walker. You are stuck with me for the rest of our lives." "That is all I have ever wanted, dear," Prescott said, and kissed her under the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, the same stars that would shine over them for all the years to come. 20 years after that fever-struck afternoon in August, Prescott stood on the porch of their home watching the sun set over the desert that had become his world. He was 48 now, his hair starting to gray at the temples, his body bearing the aches of a life spent enforcing the law in a wild land. But he was happy, genuinely, deeply happy in a way he had never imagined possible when he was a lonely 16-year-old orphan trying to figure out how to survive. Zara came out to join him, her hair more gray than dark now, but her eyes as bright and perceptive as ever. She slipped her hand into his, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to deep purple. Behind them, they could hear their children inside, Thomas home from his first year as a deputy in Prescott in the Arizona Territory, Catherine preparing to leave for medical school in San Francisco, James sketching at the kitchen table. The sound of their voices, their laughter, was the sweetest music Prescott had ever heard. "I was thinking about that day," Zara said softly. "The day we met. Do you remember?" "Every detail," Prescott replied. "You walked into my room like you owned the place, took one look at me, and decided you were going to save me whether I wanted saving or not." "You were very stubborn about it," Zara said with a laugh. "Kept insisting you were fine even though your hands were shaking from the fever." "I was trying to be strong," Prescott said. "I thought admitting I needed help was weakness." "And now?" Zara asked, though she already knew the answer. "Now I know that accepting help, accepting love, is the bravest thing anyone can do, Prescott said. You taught me that, Zara. You taught me that letting someone in does not make you weak. It makes you human. You gave me back my life that day in more ways than one. We gave each other a life, Zara corrected gently. I was just as lost as you were before we met, Prescott. Just as afraid of caring too much, of losing what mattered most. But we found each other, and we built something beautiful together. Prescott pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. I love you, he said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he spoke them 20 years ago. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Zara replied, tilting her face up for a kiss that held 2 decades of devotion and understanding and simple, profound affection. Forever and always. Prescott Walker. Forever and always. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Prescott held his wife and listened to their children's voices carrying through the open windows and thought about all the paths that had led him to this moment. The loss of his parents, the years of drifting, the fever he had tried so hard to hide, and Zara's stubborn refusal to let him suffer alone. Every hardship, every choice, every moment of doubt had been necessary to bring him here, to this porch, to this life, to this woman who had seen him at his weakest and loved him anyway. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of sage and promise, and Prescott smiled. He was home. Not just in Mineral Park, not just in Arizona territory, but here, with Zara, surrounded by the family they had built together. After all the years of being alone, of thinking he did not deserve happiness, he had found his place in the world. And it was right here. It had always been right here, waiting for the day a determined schoolteacher would walk into his life and refuse to walk back out. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Thomas married a schoolteacher from Tucson, a kind woman named Sarah, who reminded Prescott of Zara in her quiet strength. They gave him and Zara 3 grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl, who visited every summer and filled the house with laughter. Catherine finished medical school at the top of her class and opened a practice in Mineral Park, becoming the first female doctor in the territory and making both her parents impossibly proud. James moved to San Francisco to study art, and though he was far away, his letters came regularly, filled with descriptions of the city and sketches of the ocean that reminded Prescott how big the world was beyond their small desert town. When Prescott was 55, he finally retired as marshal, handing over his badge to Thomas with a mixture of pride and relief. He had served Mineral Park for nearly 3 decades, had seen it grow from a rough mining town into a proper community with schools and churches and a future. It was time, he decided, to spend his days with Zara, to travel a little, to enjoy the grandchildren, to simply be together without the weight of duty hanging over them. They took a trip to San Francisco to visit James, and Prescott saw the ocean for the first time. He stood on the beach with Zara beside him, watching waves crash against the shore with a power that took his breath away. It was beautiful and terrifying and humbling, a reminder that the world was vast and full of wonders they had barely glimpsed. "Do you wish we had seen more of this, Mayasi?" Prescott asked, gesturing at the endless expanse of water. "Traveled more? Experienced more?" "No," Zara said simply. "We built something more valuable than any amount of travel could provide, Prescott. We built a life, a family, a legacy. Our children are out in the world making a difference because we showed them what it meant to care about others, to serve with integrity, to love without reservation. That matters more than seeing every ocean or climbing every mountain." She was right, Prescott knew. Their life together had been spent in service to others, yes, but also in service to each other. Building something that would outlast them both. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. They returned to Mineral Park after 2 weeks in the city, and Prescott realized how much he had missed the desert, the wide open spaces, the startling blue of the sky, the way the mountains turned purple at sunset. This was his home, had been his home since that day he rode into town as a young deputy looking for a place to belong, and he had found it, had built it with Zara beside him, brick by brick and year by year. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the town threw them a celebration. It seemed like everyone in Mineral Park and the surrounding area showed up. Former students of Zara's who were grown now with children of their own. Men Prescott had arrested who bore him no grudge and appreciated that he had always been fair, families they had helped in 100 small ways over the years. Mrs. Chen, ancient now but still sharp as a tack, gave a speech about how she had known from the first day that Prescott and Zara were meant for each other, and everyone laughed and cheered. To Prescott and Zara, Marshall Thomas Walker said, raising his glass in a toast, the finest people I know, and not just because they are my parents. Prescott looked at his son, so tall and capable in the marshal's badge that had once been his, and felt emotion tighten his throat. Then he looked at Zara beside him, still beautiful despite the years that had softened her features and turned her hair silver. She was crying, he realized, happy tears that she made no attempt to hide, and he reached over to take her hand just as he had done 1,000 times before. I love you, he mouthed, and she smiled through her tears and mouthed back, I love you too. The party went late into the night, filled with music and dancing and stories about all the years they had shared with this community. Prescott danced with Zara, and they were still terrible at it, still stepped on each other's feet and went the wrong direction. But it did not matter, had never mattered, because they were together, and that was all that counted. When Prescott was 63, he fell ill. Not a fever this time, but something more serious. Something the doctors, including Catherine, could not quite diagnose or fix. He spent weeks in bed, weak and frustrated, and Zara never left his side. She sat in the chair beside him just as she had done 30 years earlier, though now her hair was white and her hands showed the marks of age. But her care was just as fierce, just as determined, and Prescott drew strength from her presence. You have to get better, she told him one evening when the pain was particularly bad. We have grandchildren to watch grow up, great-grandchildren to meet someday. You do not get to leave me yet, Prescott Walker. We made a deal, remember? Forever and always. Forever and always, Prescott agreed, gripping her hand as tightly as his weakened state allowed. I am not going anywhere, Zara, not if I can help it. And somehow, miraculously, he recovered. It took months, and he was never quite as strong as he had been before, but he lived. Catherine said it was his stubborn determination, the same trait that had kept him going as a lawman for so many years. Thomas said it was because he had too much to live for to give up. But Prescott knew the truth. He lived because Zara refused to let him go, because her love was strong enough to pull him back from the edge just as it had been strong enough to heal him all those years ago when she had first walked into his life. They grew old together, Prescott and Zara, watching the world change around them. The Arizona Territory became a state in 1912, and they attended the celebration with their children and grandchildren, marveling at how much had transformed since they first met. Automobiles appeared on the streets of Mineral Park, replacing horses. Electricity came to the town, and suddenly their evenings were lit by bright bulbs instead of oil lamps. The world was moving forward faster and faster, but some things remained constant. Their love, their family, the home they had built together in the desert. On Prescott's 70th birthday, the town unveiled a plaque in his honor, commemorating his 3 decades of service as deputy and marshal. He stood in front of it with Zara beside him, their children and grandchildren gathered around, and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Not just for the recognition, though that was meaningful, but for the life he had been allowed to live, for the woman who had saved him in more ways than one, for the family they had created, for every ordinary and extraordinary moment that had brought him to this point. Thank you, he said to the assembled crowd, his voice not as strong as it once was, but still clear, for this honor, for welcoming a young deputy with no family and giving me a home. But most of all, thank you for bringing Zara to Mineral Park. She is the best thing that ever happened to me, And I thank God every day that she was stubborn enough to force me to rest by the fire all those years ago, stubborn enough to stay even when I tried to push her away, stubborn enough to build this life with me. He turned to her. This woman who had been his partner, his love, his everything for more than 3 decades. I love you, Zara, today, tomorrow, and for whatever time we have left, forever and always. Forever and always, Yarige, Zara replied, and kissed him in front of everyone, in front of their children and grandchildren and the whole town that had become their extended family. And Prescott Walker, former deputy marshal and orphan and lonely man, knew that he was the luckiest person alive. They had several more good years together, years filled with family dinners and quiet evenings on the porch, and the simple joy of waking up next to each other every morning. When Zara's health began to fail, when her sharp mind started to dim and her strong body grew frail, Prescott cared for her with the same devotion she had once shown him. He sat by her bedside, held her hand, reminded her of their story every day so she would not forget. The day they met, the first time they said they loved each other, their wedding, the births of their children, every precious memory he could recall, he shared with her, trying to keep the thread of their life together bright and clear even as age tried to steal it away. She died peacefully one spring morning in 1918, surrounded by family, her hand clasped in Prescott's. Her last words were, "I love you." And Prescott held her as she slipped away, his heart breaking even as he was grateful she was no longer suffering. She had been 74 years old, and they had been married for 42 years. It was not enough. A lifetime would not have been enough. But it was what they had been given, and Prescott treasured every single day of it. He lived for 2 more years after Zara died, years that felt empty despite being surrounded by his children and grandchildren. He had lost the other half of himself, and without her the world seemed colorless and flat. But he kept going, kept living, because that is what Zara would have wanted. He told their grandchildren stories about their grandmother, about how fierce and determined and loving she had been. He made sure they understood what an extraordinary woman she was, how she had changed not just his life, but the whole town through her teaching and her care for others. On a warm evening in May 1920, Prescott sat on his porch watching the sun set over the desert one last time. He was 76 years old and his body was tired, ready to rest. As the sky turned gold and pink and purple, he closed his eyes and thought about Zara, about the way she had looked the day they met, young and determined and utterly unwilling to leave him to suffer alone. He thought about their wedding day, about holding their newborn children, about 1,000 ordinary moments that had made up their extraordinary life together. Forever and always, he whispered to the desert wind, and felt a strange peace settle over him. He was going to see her again. He knew it with absolute certainty. Whatever came after this life, Zara would be there, waiting for him with that brilliant smile that had captured his heart from the very beginning. Thomas found him an hour later, slumped peacefully in his chair with a smile on his weathered face. The entire town mourned the passing of their beloved former marshal, the man who had protected them for so long and helped build Mineral Park into the thriving community it had become. They buried him next to Zara in the small cemetery at the edge of town, and on the shared headstone, Thomas had inscribed the words his father had spoken so often, "Forever and always." Their children carried on their legacy. Thomas served as marshal for another 20 years before retiring, always trying to live up to the example his father had set. Catherine continued her medical practice, saving countless lives and breaking barriers for women in medicine. James became a renowned artist, his paintings of the desert Southwest hanging in galleries across the country. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren spread across Arizona and beyond, but they all knew the story of Prescott and Zara, the lawman and the school teacher who had found each other in a small desert town and built something beautiful together. And sometimes on warm evenings when the desert wind whispered through Mineral Park, Longtime residents swore they could see two figures standing at the edge of town, hand in hand, watching the sunset together. Just shadows, maybe, or tricks of the light. Or maybe, just maybe, two souls who had promised forever and always and meant it even beyond the boundaries of life itself. Because some loves are strong enough to transcend time and death, strong enough to echo through generations, strong enough to last literally forever. The story of Prescott Walker and Zara Olsen became legend in Mineral Park, told and retold until it was impossible to separate fact from fiction. But the essential truth remained clear through every retelling. Once upon a time, a stubborn deputy tried to hide a dangerous fever, and a determined schoolteacher noticed and made him rest by the fire. And from that simple act of care, from that moment of one person refusing to let another suffer alone, grew a love that changed two lives, shaped a town, and created a legacy that would endure long after both of them were gone. It was a love story in the truest sense, made real not through grand gestures, but through small daily choices to care, to stay, to build something together, even when it was difficult. It was the kind of love that mattered, that made a difference, that proved two broken people could find each other in the vast emptiness of the desert and create something whole and beautiful and eternal. And that, in the end, was all that really mattered. Not the hardships they faced or the obstacles they overcame, but the simple fact that they found each other, chose each other, and loved each other with everything they had for as long as they lived. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.